The Tao of Heidegger by Tim Delaune. The question of Heidegger's politics. One final question regarding Heidegger remains to be addressed from the vantage of Taoism, and it is the thorniest. Why did Heidegger fail publicly, or so far as we are aware, even privately, to repudiate his involvement with the Nazi Party? That Taoism may have something to say about this is indicated by the context and timing of Heidegger's interest in the Tao Te Ching. Heidegger's interest in Lao Tzu and in translating the Tao Te Ching was, according to Pögeler, connected temporally and substantively with the small book From the Experience of Thinking that he wrote while convalescing after a breakdown he suffered during the course of denazification proceedings. Moreover, Heidegger's proposal to Zhao that the two collaborate on a translation of that work came at the end of a conversation on a chance meeting on the streets of Freiburg. There, Heidegger, in the midst of the interviews he was obliged to give to French forces as part of the process of his mandated denazification, confronted Zhao with a question as to what Zhao would say if people made contradictory assertions about the same piece of Zhao's writing. Heidegger explained that the Nazis had accused him of being non-Aryan based on a passage in Being and Time, and that the French had now presented him with the same passage as evidence that he was a Nazi true believer. Zhao reports that he responded thus, quote, "Professor Heidegger, you ask me what I say to the statements of the Nazis and the Allies. I can only give you a Chinese answer. I find that the surely false interpretations of the Nazis and the Allies attest to the same thing. In the future, one must surely study your philosophy more assiduously and carefully. If it is understood properly, it will have great relevance for the future. Mencius said, if heaven wants to impose a difficult task on someone, it first fills his heart and will with bitterness, rots his sinew and bones, starves his frame, imposes great poverty upon his body, and confounds his undertakings, so that his heart will be inspired, his nature stimulated, and his deficiencies remedied. From all these things we learn that life arises out of anxiety and care, misery and privation, and that death, on the other hand, is the product of comforts and pleasure." Unquote. This is a sympathetic response, to be sure, and one that may have helped convince Heidegger that his political entanglement would be a lifelong test. He apparently chose to respond to the test by refusing, consistent with Taoist practice, to answer the question. George Steiner believes that only conjecture is possible with regard to Heidegger's silence on his involvement with National Socialism, but himself guesses that, though Heidegger was a towering genius of philosophy, he was at the same time a very small man. It may well be that he did not have the courage or magnanimity needed to confront his own political past. What follows is certainly not a refutation of Heidegger's potential for smallness, but at the same time his stance was not entirely unprincipled, and certainly is not inconsistent with his work in general. Throughout Heidegger's thought, there is a tendency to denigrate judgments of value, at least facially. For instance, in Being and Time, Heidegger presents two kinds of being, authenticity and inauthenticity, but insists that the latter does not signify a lesser being or a lower degree of being. Similarly, Heidegger introduces the concept of unmeaningful Dasein, and then insists that the term does not imply a value judgment but expresses an ontological determination. Likewise, Heidegger, in discussing the notion of idle talk, claims that the term is not to be used here in a disparaging sense. This tendency to eschew judgments of value is more fully explained in the letter on humanism thus, quote, "To think against values is not to maintain that everything interpreted as a value, culture, art, science, human dignity, world, and God, is valueless. Rather, it is important finally to realize that precisely through the characterization of something as a value, what is so valued is robbed of its worth." Unquote. This radical rejection of values would seem to follow directly from the assertion in the Introduction to Metaphysics that, quote, "as maintaining logos has the character of pervasive sway, of physis, it does not dissolve what it pervades into an empty lack of opposites. Instead, by unifying what contends, the gathering maintains it in the highest acuteness of its tension." Unquote. Likewise, the Tao Te Ching positively discourages us from making moral judgments. Though this idea pervades the text, it is perhaps best illustrated by Chapter 2, which states that all values are simply constituted by their opposites, and thus apparently do not have independent existence or meaning. When the people of the earth all know beauty as beauty, there arises the recognition of ugliness. When the people of the earth all know the good as good, there arises the recognition of evil. Therefore, being and non-being interdepend in growth. Difficult and easy interdepend in completion. Long and short interdepend in contrast. High and low interdepend in position. Tones and voice interdepend in harmony. Front and behind interdepend in company. Or, as soon as everyone in the world knows that the beautiful are beautiful, there is already ugliness. As soon as everyone knows the able, there is ineptness. Determinacy, yu, and indeterminacy, wu, give rise to each other. Difficult and easy complement each other. Long and short set each other off. High and low complete each other. Refined notes and raw sounds harmonize with each other, and before and after lend sequence to each other. This is really how it all works. Such a radical rejection of value might seem fine on paper, but in connection with the Nazi regime it tends to stick in the craw. In this sense, perhaps, Heidegger's refusal to own up to his role, however small, in Nazism represents not smallness, as Steiner suggests, but rather a kind of foolish, if oddly courageous insistence upon living according to his own belief that good and evil have no independent significance. Conclusion. This paper is hardly the first attempt to use the connections between Heidegger and Taoism to ask whether one can see in the latter any light that can illuminate the ideas of the former. Nonetheless, it has attempted to demonstrate that behind the sometimes seeming illogic of Heidegger's thoughts and deeds lies a refusal to engage in logic in a Western sense at all, and that this refusal is readily understandable according to certain strains of Eastern philosophy. There are still substantial puzzles. Why Heidegger did not adequately publicly acknowledge his debt to Taoism, whether Taoism provides an adequate explanation of his limited published thoughts on politics, and whether Taoism's rejection of values properly explains Heidegger's unwillingness to own up to his Nazi past. As Pogler put it, quote, was Heidegger's excursion, wandering away from his time, as legend has it, of Lao Tzu's, forced by the decline of the age and environment, or was it not also an escape from the context of guilt in which the wanderer had become entangled through his own doing, and which he was unable to tolerate? Our experiences and motives which must belong to the thinking of our time not being unfairly set aside, the experience of guilt and of evil become also for Meister Eckhart, for Nietzsche, for Lao Tzu, and for Zen Buddhism something of second rank. Unquote. But while these puzzles may be of historical and bibliographical interest, what is perhaps most important politically about a Taoist reading of Heidegger's thought is its relevance to understanding the role of technology with respect to the being of humans and other beings. I close with a provocative example from a contemporary controversy. Bear in mind that, as we have already seen, Heidegger raised strong objections in The Question Concerning Technology to unthinking use of technology on both sustainability and fungibility grounds. These objections surface as well in his interview with Der Spiegel, in which he admits to being frightened when he saw pictures coming from the moon to the earth, as this was an example of technology tearing men loose from the earth and uprooting them, a fright he links as well to nuclear weapons. Recently, no less a figure than Pope Francis characterized 3 specific technologies as destroying, plotting designs of death, and disfiguring the face of man and woman, destroying creation, identifying these technologies in turn as nuclear arms, genetic manipulation, and gender theory, where the last has been understood specifically as a reference to gender reassignment surgery, often undergone by people who desperately desire that their bodily sexual attributes be consistent with their expressed and deeply felt gender identities. At first blush, these comments might seem consistent with Heidegger's concerns regarding technology as something that uproots beings from their being. And of course there is no way to be certain what Heidegger might have had to say about transgendered persons. But think Heidegger through Taoism. Does gender reassignment surgery implicate sustainability? Trivially at most. Only if we assume that transgendered persons would otherwise have engaged in reproductive sexual relations, absent the possibility of becoming physically who they are in spirit, is there even colorable sustainability concern. More significantly, does gender reassignment surgery implicate fungibility? Not at all. Instead, it facilitates transgendered beings being, rather than consigning that being to, arguably, technologically based norms of gender expression and behavior. Instead, it seems to me, this technological innovation mirrors the recent development of glasses that can allow the colorblind to see color. Arguably, such technologies do not uproot humanity, but make humans more fully human. In contrast, providing so-called bionic devices to humans to give them superhuman capabilities might be, for Heidegger, more like moonshots and atomic bombs, a distortion of being, uninformed by any attempt to think through its consequences. If Pope Francis was channeling Heidegger at all in his comments, it was in an entirely vulgar way. What follows from this is space for a more nuanced evaluation, in light of Taoist thinking, of technological change in light of environmental and ontological concerns, a space that is urgently in need of further exploratory thought.